It's a tale of two cities. In Beijing, the biggest military parade in recent memory to mark the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. Xi Jinping's display of force, including impressive new hardware, and the biggest tribute to Mao Zedong since the Cultural Revolution. Over in Hong Kong, pro-democracy activists braving a ban on demonstrations with, for the first time since the movement began in June, police shooting a protester with live ammunition. What next now? What next for the territory's one nation, two systems status? The final decision seems down to a single man. Xi Jinping has managed to consolidate more power into his hands than any Chinese leader since Mao. Is it over for the collegial governance of old? And with this radical change at the top, are we ultimately looking at a China that's weaker or stronger? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at China at 70. And with us, we brought two people who perhaps can look young people who can look ahead to what China at 100 will look like. Xiaowen Zhen is a student at the American University of Paris. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks as well to student protester Kenneth Young, member of the Paris-based Committee for the Freedom of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Also joining us, André Lezekrug-Pietri, founder of A Capital. Welcome back to the show.
Good evening.
And Juliette Juvenaz, China Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Research, IRSEM.
Nice to be here.
Thanks for being with us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, months of preparation, entire neighborhoods of the capital under a lockdown for weeks, factories closed to dissipate the smog. Nothing was left to chance for Xi Jinping's big parade, and a day of festivities that extended into the night with impressive fireworks. Clément Bonnereau has more.
Row upon row of soldiers in perfect lines, Beijing brought out the big guns to mark 70 years of Communist Party rule, with one of the biggest military parades in the country's history. 15,000 soldiers and hundreds of military vehicles filled Tiananmen Square, while more than 150 aircraft flew in formations overhead. Cutting-edge military technology, including a hypersonic drone, was also on display. But the real star of the show was the Chinese president. Standing in the exact spot where Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping praised his country's economic and military prowess.
There is no force that can shake the foundations of this nation. No force can stop the Chinese people and the Chinese nation forging ahead.
Xi Jinping, who became president in 2012, is now widely described as one of the most powerful leaders in China's history. Under his leadership, the country has become the world's second largest economy, growing ever more assertive on the global stage. At home, he's best known for his aggressive campaign against corruption, targeting both high and low-ranking party officials. To his critics, though, Xi Jinping is an authoritarian leader who's ruthlessly clamped down on freedoms while tightening his grip on power. He was allowed to remain president for life after lawmakers removed the two-term limit on the presidency last year.
Before I ask you, André Lezekrug-Pietri, what you thought of the parade, something that happened the day before, on Monday, a ceremony steeped in significance, Xi Jinping leading top officials to become the first head of state since the end of the Cultural Revolution to pay respects at Mao Zedong's mausoleum at Tiananmen Square, bowing 3 times before the embalmed remains of China's founders. What was that about?
Well, I think that this is exactly the most symbolic part of it. It's that it's a real departure of what used to be the Chinese strategy of a low and silent rise and learning from the world. and it was Deng Xiaoping's really philosophy is rise, but be modest about it, and don't make the whole world worry about the size of China. Xi Jinping has taken a totally different stand, and as you said, it's the first time that the standing president bows 3 times symbolically in front of Mao Zedong, who was always like seen as a founding father, but not really the father of the economic miracle of China that we experienced in the 40 last year. So we are seeing really a departure from this silent, modest China. Some people may even say that this much more assertive China has waken up people like Donald Trump, and everything which happens currently is sometimes maybe a consequence of all this.
How do you read it, Juliette Givenaz?
Yesterday's visit or today's?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
both, I would say.
Sure. Xi Jinping has definitely made the form of a comeback of Mao Zedong style politics. He's personalized power to a level that we haven't seen since Mao.
Why has nobody before him gone to this mausoleum? No sitting president, I mean.
Because right after Mao's death, there had been a consensus within the party to say that Mao's heritage was 70% right, 30% wrong. There was a wave of criticism of Mao after his death. And then the whole era of reform and opening that started in 78 and broadly stopped in 2013 was all about changing the course of China's development. Xi Jinping has put an end to that era of reform and opening, and at the same time, he's reappropriated the Mao heritage so it makes perfect sense that he goes back to a pre-reform era of political style.
To the pre-reform era, Xiaowan Chen, are you happy with that?
Well, it's obviously, we can tell from Xi Jinping's recent clampdown on activism across China. And this is not something we've seen in the administration of Deng Xiaoping, for instance. This has actually been contrary to what the establishment or the Chinese Communist Party's political culture have developed over the years. And one first sign that we saw was the removal of term limits for the presidency of the Chinese Communist Party. So what we're seeing is essentially an end, and I agree completely that it's an end to the reform period. But what we're also seeing is that Xi Jinping is looking at Mao as an idol. For instance, when he went to the parade wearing a Mao suit as well. And there's many policies that he has employed over the years which reflect many of Mao Zedong's old policies. So what we can see from his administration is he might be sort of taking Mao Zedong as an idol, but at the same time, he's developing his own style of leadership. And whether most of China would agree with that is up for debate.
You say there'd be division in China over whether or not it's the right thing to do to bow 3 times before Mao's mausoleum.
I think Mao Zedong is like what my fellow speaker has said. He's been a controversial figure in China, and I think most political leaders in China have tried to avoid looking up to Mao Zedong. At the same time, there is sort of this understanding that Mao Zedong played a part in the Second Chinese Civil War. So it's very hard to tell what the Chinese people are sort of their reaction to Mao Zedong's or to Xi Jinping's administration.
And obviously, this is much more of a talking point inside of China, Kenneth Young, than the events that we're going to talk about in a moment from Hong Kong. Your thoughts on it?
Mm-hmm. In Hong Kong, I think we do not agree to this gesture, and then we see this gesture as a kind of re-establishing Mao's authoritarian, even totalitarian image for the Chinese regime, and this is extremely dangerous. And for Hong Kong, actually, I think we actually want to avoid from different kinds of interference, no matter the political, economic, and cultural interference in Hong Kong, because we want to maintain very tightly the one country, two systems.
Lots to talk about from that parade, but of course the image that will strike in many people's minds is among those in attendance. We saw the chief executives of Macau and of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, who is nearly 2,000 kilometers away from another day of protests and one that will long be remembered. Your thoughts on that?
For me, and then I think it's not very appropriate. I mean, for Carrie Lam and then to attend this kind of meeting if she really wants to treat the will of the people in Hong Kong, but of course in a national sense, and then she has a place and to go to attend the ceremony there. I think the problem for Carrie Lam since June 2019, and then she just tries to ignore all the demands of the Hong Kong people, and then she tries not to have the dialogue, and then she keeps distant, always away from the Hong Kong protesters until the very near epoch of the Chinese National Day, and then maybe she received some of the commands from the Chinese regime, and then she tries to kick off a so-called dialogue with the Hong Kong people.
Andrzej Pietri, she was weakened before, she even further weakened after today.
I mean, probably the decision to take back this controversial law that first was suspended was typically too late, too slow. The fact that she's in Beijing today for the National Day, that does not shock me, because all the leaders of and Macau and Hong Kong leaders are part of this ruling group. To be in Beijing for the parade is not a surprise. Obviously, it coincides with the day of very violent demonstrations. But I would like to come back to this figure of Mao. I think that must create a lot of debate. I mean, let's not forget, and I was actually in Beijing for the 60th year. By the way, all the Chinese leaders on the Independence Days usually wear Mao suits, so that's not a big surprise. Hu Jintao did the same, and I think Jiang Zemin also. But the fact that today Mao is coming back as this figure must create a lot of discussion within the families, because most of the families in China, including that of Xi Jinping, have been huge victims of the Cultural Revolution. They were sent out. Most of the families got dispersed. Some people were sent to the campaigns, etc. So I think it's a pretty risky move. I mean, I'm not a political analyst of the Chinese, but I think Xi Jinping has been working on this nationalist dream.
A risky move. He's got such a tight grip on power.
Yes, but for 40 years, this was probably the miracle of China. The Chinese Communist Party, let's not forget Deng Xiaoping was there in 1989, and he's the guy who actually ultimately called the shot, to take the expression, for Tiananmen Square. But for 40 years, it was seen as a regime that focused on political grip, but a lot of freedom on the economic and even on a social level. Today, the grip is much more firm, and some people even compare, we heard a lot about the defense spending, that if you spend more for your internal security than for your external security, who is really the enemy. So there is a lot of debate. I know that, much more quieter than before, because people speak much less out than they used to speak 5 or 6 years ago, about whether or not this tight road, also against the US, is the right way to go.
You agree with that, Juliette Giovanazzi, that it is a risk?
To go back to Mao. I think it's no big surprise, though. Like, Xi Jinping has been walking that line ever since he got to power 7 years ago now. So his involvement in the Cultural Revolution is also very well known. His position after having experienced that fundamental political experience was to reappropriate the party and make the party his vehicle for power. So all that, the symbolism that he's today bringing to the fore, be it the military, be it Mao Zedong as the father of the nation, is perfectly in line with what we've been seeing ever since he took power in 2012.
So what's the significance, for instance, of rolling out these giant ballistic missiles that can hit the United States in 30 minutes? What are the DF-41s, I believe they're called?
Yeah, so I mean, this military parade, again, is a reappropriation of a very, Maoist era instrument of political projection. So in the first decade of Mao's rule, there was a military parade every year. Obviously, the Chinese military has modernized at very high speeds, starting in the 1990s. So, but this is...
Yeah, they've cut the number of personnel and reformed it.
Yes, but that also is an ongoing trend ever since Deng Xiaoping started the four modernizations of the country. So Xi Jinping, what we see under Xi Jinping is very extreme, but he's only taking the tools that were in place before him.
Were there any surprises in that parade? We saw there were these new drones.
There were not. My colleague from the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, Antoine Bondaz, had just published a report before this parade, where he had identified all the armament that we're seeing today. So this is a very old school way of showing a country's force, one that, France doesn't hesitate to use. We have a military parade every year.
Every year.
So, I mean, obviously China has become this major military power that has actually triggered an arms race in Asia. This is without doubt that China's military modernization is clearly accruing tensions in the region. But the way that Xi Jinping uses this symbol to bolster his own power in the country is nothing new in the Chinese context.
When we come back, we'll pick up on those points. And also remember that October the 1st, 2019 was also the day when, for the first time, police in Hong Kong used live ammunition. We'll be talking about that when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're talking on what's been a day of contrasts with the protests in Hong Kong and in China. The might of Xi Jinping on full display with that giant parade, 15,000 soldiers, 100,000 participants. We're talking about it with Xiaowan Shen, student at the American University of Paris. Welcome back as well to Kenneth Jung, member of the Paris-based Committee for the Freedom of Hong Kong, André Lozekrug-Pietri, founder of A Capital, and Juliette Jevenaz, who's China Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Research, IRSEM. Juliette, who was telling us just before the break how, the hardware that was shown off during that show of force during the parade, there were no big surprises, she said.
I mean, it's true that the famous the ICBM that was displayed, the Dongfeng 41, capable of reaching the US, 15 multiple warheads, solid fuel. This is first time they displayed. It was announced. The one thing that struck me, and I think that struck a lot of people, was the display of the hypersonic gliders. And this is new because neither the US nor France has displayed their capabilities in that. If it flies, in another story. But if it flies, it will change completely the doctrine of what we call access denial, which is the way of intruding into
just explain that to us, why that matters.
I mean, the hypersonic, hypervelocity is one of the new frontiers of military doctrine. It's basically a capacity of going Mach 6, Mach 7, Mach 8, which today goes against any kind of anti-missile protection. When you see how much waves the attack with drones on Saudi Arabia caused 2 weeks ago, and this was on very conventional drones, very high precision, but conventional drones. Imagine one can do such a glider if it goes as fast. It could go against any kind of barrier in the US or in Europe. And that's very worrying.
Okay, so the attention that's been paid to the Chinese military modernization, especially under Trump, is definitely worth it, but I don't think that China has any intention of using any of these equipments. The current situation in Hong Kong is showing the fragility of the Chinese Communist Party and the the lack of support that I think a military intervention would have within the Chinese population, thus undermining the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy at home. So I think what I was trying to say earlier is that these demonstrations of military force have first and foremost a political purpose, I think, rather than a military one against any potential enemy.
All right, you mentioned Hong Kong raining on Xi Jinping's parade, there'd been a ban on demonstrating this Tuesday. Brian Quinn has more on what happened in the territory.
A day of rage carrying into the night, as Tuesday brought some of the fiercest clashes ever in Hong Kong's young pro-democracy movement. The afternoon had already seen unprecedented violence. During fighting in the Sun Wan district, a riot officer fired a live round into the chest of a teenage protester, the first such incident in 4 months of demonstrations. In Tuen Mun, batons and shields weren't enough for riot police, who were forced to retreat into an administrative building. Outside the British consulate, protesters called on Hong Kong's former colonial ruler for help. Britain's Foreign Secretary on Tuesday called police use of live ammunition disproportionate, with both the UK and the EU urging dialogue and de-escalation.
The right of assembly and the right to demonstrate peacefully must continue to be upheld in line with the basic law and international commitments.
With the People's Republic of China celebrating its 70th anniversary, symbols of the mainland's National Day and President Xi Jinping were a common target of Hong Kong demonstrators. Their movement, begun as opposition to a now shelved extradition bill, has since expanded to demand an independent investigation into police brutality and popular elections for a government that is falling increasingly under Beijing's control. With dusk falling, police fired tear gas from close range, using colored water cannon to disperse demonstrators, making arrests as they went. Medical authorities say dozens of people have been admitted to hospitals for injuries sustained during Tuesday's protests.
Kenneth Young, your reaction to those images?
Actually, what I saw, I would like to mention also a little bit about the water cannon, because when we see the water cannon here in France or maybe in other countries, and then the use of the water cannons are very different in Hong Kong, because if you see the water is actually blue in color. Why? Actually, they add different kinds of chemicals, even the pepper spray and also some chemicals from the tear gas into the water, which is totally prohibited and also violated the rules or the instructions of the water cannon. For example, from the factory of France, which exported this cannon to Hong Kong. And actually, we have already checked that it's a kind of violation of these instructions. But now, actually, it's not just only the water cannon, but also the close shirt of the tear gas, the ammunitions, and different kinds of the use of the police force are actually violating also the international laws and also the instructions of different kinds of non-lethal crowd control arms.
We saw Tuesday an escalation on both sides. Obviously, police firing live ammunition for the very first time. And the protesters, at one point, in that particular instance where an 18-year-old was shot, surrounding police and beating one up at that point.
I think we have to know the political context in Hong Kong, because we have had a very long history of nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations since the retrocession of Hong Kong. And actually, we maintained this principle until the revolution, the Umbrella Revolution. And I think the many youngsters become more and more desperate after the crash of the revolution. But even since then, and we still uphold very tightly the principle of nonviolence, civil disobedience, all kinds of means without any kinds of violence, until the outbreak of the very huge police violence since the end of June, because the first day of this kind of police violence was 12th of June. But after that, and then this kind of police violence became more and more unlimited. And also the police was trying to cooperate with the triads, with different kinds of nationalists, Chinese nationalists in Hong Kong, trying to attack the people without any restrictions.
Xiao Wenshen, how do you tone it down now? How do you do the de-escalation that the EU is calling for?
Well, I think just going back to the water cannons, it was actually used as a way to mark these protesters so that they could be identified later on. And many of these protesters, they do wear helmets and they do wear masks to identify to conceal their identity. And back to the point of the 18-year-old that was shot, I think he was shot in the police officer that shot the 18-year-old was actually acting in self-defense because he was attacked by these two teenagers with batons. So it's really
French riot police don't bring guns to a demonstration.
But this was a regular 35 caliber gun. It was a regularly issued gun for Hong Kong police. So they don't use it until the last resort. And what I'm saying, though, is that it really depends on your perspective in terms of whether the protesters are acting in violence or the police are acting in violence. But again, I mean, these police officers are not from the Chinese mainland. They're Hong Kongers themselves, too. So, I mean, looking at the pictures and the videos, you can tell that both sides have suffered. So I think it's up for for debate whether actually the protesters have been acting aggressively or whether the police officers have acted aggressively.
I would like to respond to your opinion because first of all about the blue water actually is just reported by the Hong Kong police or by the Chinese government or Hong Kong government that is not harmful or is something just like water and then putting some materials in brew inside. But it's not true because actually there are different kinds of medical reports before that and then showing that this kind of materials, they also mix up with different kinds of chemicals which cause different kinds of burns on the skin. And we have different kinds of reports also done by Amnesty International Hong Kong. And then I think this is some facts that we cannot refute. This is the first thing. And the second thing is about this kind of self-defense discourse. I highly adopted that because actually, as you said, and then the French police will not carry real guns in the repression of demonstrations, first of all. And secondly, actually, if we watch back the videos, and then it's not really in the last stance. And then, of course, and then they're holding the batons. And then I'm not saying that the protesters are doing all the things correctly, but and then we have to judge and question that whether it's really the last chance to pull out the gun.
So it's another escalation this Tuesday, and fortunately that 18-year-old was not killed. What happens now? How do you? Because you said we agreed in part one that the chief executive is discredited to a large degree. Who do you negotiate with? What happens next?
I think for negotiation now is very different, very difficult in Hong Kong because the whole movement, which is very different from that in 2014, is that the movement consists of no leader actually, and in this case, and then we cannot have a hope to ask for any kinds of leaders or representatives to do a kind of negotiation with the government. But on the other hand, we have through different kinds of social media. I'm very confident, and what I observed that is the protesters actually they try to use the social media to communicate, to organize, and even they will try to reach different kinds of compromise and negotiations. Between the protesters, between the organizations,
between themselves,
and yes, and
but what about with the central government?
And the most important thing is that about the 5 demands, because at the very beginning we have already raised these 5 demands, and these 5 demands are highly attached to the situation in Hong Kong, which is totally fundamentally related to the extradition bill. Firstly, for a withdrawal of the extradition bill. And the last one actually is about the democratization, which is actually the final solution and the most fundamental solution to all kinds of political crises in Hong Kong.
André Leduc-Petrie, we heard the speech from Xi Jinping. He talked about one country, two systems, and he didn't deviate from the script when it came to Hong Kong in his speech in Beijing this Tuesday. But what does he do with a leaderless movement? What's he going to do?
Well, I mean, we've seen that, and no comparison, of course, how difficult it is for societies when you have a leaderless movement. We saw that in France in a much different context, obviously, a couple of months ago. It's extremely complicated. I would, on this one, I'm not sure that Xi Jinping, nobody knows, of course, would have talked about Hong Kong if specifically in his speech, the fact that he really underlined, that's only a speech, that he is firmly attached to the one country, two system is probably, maybe some people can interpret that as a way to say, okay, maybe we went too far. Because what happened in the last years, and just to complement on what has been just said, is there have been regular infringements of what was supposed to be the deal between the UK and China when there was the retrocession. That means no intervention in the public affairs of Hong Kong until 2049. And obviously, we saw in the recent elections, in the nomination of the chief executive, that it was not really done in this way. Maybe it's a way to signalize, okay, we'll keep it like that, at least for foresight. So,
and you said at the beginning of part one, Juliette, that Juliette Genoves, that this whole crisis shows that he's weakened in a certain sense, Xi Jinping.
Definitely. I think that the crisis in Hong Kong is really hitting at the core of the Chinese Communist Party's mandate to power, which is to keep political and social stability. And the reason why the Hong Kong protests do not have leaders is very clear. In 2014, the leaders all got put into jail for several months after the umbrella movement. So the reason why there's no leaders in Hong Kong is not because they're disorganized, it's for mere survival. For the protest to exist and to be able to express itself, they cannot have leaders, otherwise the protest will be immediately suppressed. So I think that the negotiation method on the part of the Hong Kong demonstrators is pretty clear and simple. They have expressed 5 demands, and Beijing and the Hong Kong executive have refused to address them.
Actually, I would like to add also one more point. I think I do not agree to all what you said about the leaderless movement. I mean, to compare with the movement between Hong Kong and France, because of course, for Yellow West, when we know that it's a kind of leaderless movement, but I mean the whole process and the mode of organization of the movement in Hong Kong is totally different. For example, if you look back to the use of the social media, how they organize, how they construct all the discourse in France, and then it's for. Yeah, I would like to frankly say that for Hong Kong, it's much more advanced, and they evolve much more, and then they can use
really, because oftentimes the Yellow Vests were one step ahead of the police in some instances.
Yeah, of course, but I mean in Hong Kong, and then they have much more advanced, and then they can avoid of different kinds of strategic loopholes, and then they can encounter a lot of things, a lot of difficulties through the social media, and I'm quite confident that for this kind of leaderless movement, and it's not saying that we don't have any kind of compromise, or we don't have any kinds of the consent or the discussion. Actually, we have a lot of discussion. We have a lot of things within this kind of social media. Is the first thing. And the second thing is that actually even the pro-establishment, I mean the pro-Beijing camp from the ex-chairman of the DAB is a party which is very close to the Chinese government. And then he also said that actually, if you really want to resolve this political crisis, why not establish an independent inquiry team? And then why not, if you really think that the police is really obeying the rule of law, etc., etc. And second thing, why not just reopen the dialogues for the democratization? We try to establish a kind of the dialogues on the universal suffrage, not just only for the chief executive, but also for the parliament, for the legislature.
Right.
Because now and then, if without a real democratic legislature, the Hong Kong people cannot really voice out their things, and then they can just only go to the streets.
And it could get worse. André Lézécugue-Pétry, you have this question of whether or not there'll be a Tiananmen-style crackdown in Hong Kong, and yet at the same time, we're seeing that Hong Kong still matters, still the world's third financial center, still you can see here on this graph how, as the part in blue is the GDP of China, how Since the Hong Kong handover, its size has perhaps shrunk, but it's still the go-to place for buying Chinese bonds, for offshore initial public offerings when Chinese companies open their capital to the outside world. People don't like the capital controls they get when they go to Shanghai. So Xi Jinping, how badly does he need Hong Kong still?
I mean, the Chinese economy needs it more than ever. I mean, indeed, it's 3% of Chinese GDP. It used to be 15% 20 years ago. So that went down, but it's still 60% of all investments into China are channeled through Hong Kong. And at the time of a trade war, obviously, this exchange, this window to the world, this member of WTO and many other international organizations, the fact that you can freely convert into foreign currency, which you can't. I don't completely agree with the fact that reforms have stopped, that we will see if it really works. Probably what's happening with the trade war make a lot of people think that actually the Chinese economy needs more opening than it used to maybe need 2 or 3 years ago. But what is sure is that they cannot, the cost of losing Hong Kong is way too big. And I think the only way that this dilemma will be solved will be probably by a change of people. I mean, I think that the current chief executive, you know, in some crises, you don't necessarily, in order to get people around the negotiation table, you don't necessarily need sometimes really big advancements. Sometimes change of people is...
Or change of personnel. Xiao and Chen, you agree?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Hong Kong is definitely a financial hub in China, but it also represents politically the one country, two system has ramifications for cross Chinese straits relations between Taiwan, for instance.
Yeah, we didn't mention Taiwan. Unfortunately, we're short on time.
Yeah, but it is important to note that, you know, the Chinese government is tolerating what's happening in Hong Kong. I don't think there's going to be a Tiananmen Square massacre again. I highly doubt that. But I do think that Hong Kong has other political and economic importance to China. So I think it's important to sort of like look at Hong Kong, but also look at the global geostrategic ramifications, particularly when it comes to Taiwan, and particularly when it comes to other separatist regions in China as well. So it represents sort of insight into the future as to how China is going to deal with these situations across the country.
Yeah, and it's definitely the topic for another debate, which we'd love to have you all back for. I want to thank Xiao Wen-Chen. I want to thank as well André Lezecoq-Pretry, Juliette Genevaz. I also want to thank Kenneth Young. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Simon Harding.
Good evening, Francois. Good evening, everyone. As you can imagine, plenty of reactions today, Francois, to the 70th anniversary, of course, of Communist China, but also to what's been going on in Hong Kong. And that's where I'd like to start in Bremer with this tweet here in this rather appropriate picture. You have the celebrations on one side and, of course, the demonstrations and the protests on the other side to show the divide between the one country, two systems, which has been really gripping Hong Kong and China. Bill Kristol, who is part of the he's the director of Defending Democracy Together, so a group of Republicans in America, but with a more liberal approach, who says, congratulations to the people of Hong Kong for standing up for freedom and best wishes to the people of China for freedom and democracy in the near future. Of course, it's a little bit of a dig there at the Chinese authorities. This article in the Los Angeles Times, which says, no national day, only national grief. Police shoot Hong Kong protester on China's 70th anniversary. So it really goes to show the violence, and that has reached an absolute new level today. Again, the Sydney Herald in Australia by Elliot Chipper, another weekend of violence for Hong Kong, a city at war with itself. So really some really strong terminology there, Francois. And it's been really picked upon by social media here. We have the Hong Kong Free Press, who tweeted that there's been a lot of casualties today, of course, extreme violence. The video which has been released of the protester getting shot, it's very graphic. I won't show it there, but I had the opportunity to see it, the police who were attacked. This is actually the response of the Hong Kong police, who said that they had no choice because they were attacked by the protesters. I don't know whether that warrants him being shot, but of course this is a tweet that's been put out by China's main global television network. And of course, as you know, Twitter and Facebook in China is actually censored. So a lot of people in mainland China won't have the opportunity to see these reactions, a lot of the social media posts, the citizen journalism, as we call it in Hong Kong.
Yeah, we heard complaints over VPNs, which companies that do business with the outside world, saying that they had tightened the screws for weeks, right, in the build-up to this 70th anniversary. And there were even criticisms from people who were pro-Beijing about that.
I mean, it has been now since several years that it was tightened, but I suppose in the last few days it was quasi impossible to use it. And by the way, it's by law now, I think, illegal to use VPNs. Huh?
VPNs, which are...
But everybody uses it.
Yeah. Those things that tell your IP.
It hides your IP.
Your location.
But it is very risky, as you say, to use that in China because, of course, the repercussions can be quite severe. Again, this tweet from Amnesty International, Francois, shooting of a protester in Hong Kong marks an alarming development in the police's response to protests. We call on them to launch the investigation. Tweet also highlights the demands of the protesters, of course, who are demanding this separate inquiry into what's been going on. People's Daily China, again, to show you the point of view that's coming from mainland China, which is saying, you know, again, officers' lives threatened by protesters' attacks. So the terminology, once again, very defensive of what the authorities have had to deal with. Pete Alexander, for a more global view on this, Trump congratulates China on its anniversary of Communist Party rule after Hong Kong police shot a protester with a live round for the first time since those protests began. Somehow, President Donald Trump always on the receiving end of this. But it is important because it shows how perhaps if he endorses the system, then China can, in a way, continue doing what they are doing. Brian Klaas, again, more or less in the same spheres as our previous tweet today. They shot a protester in Hong Kong. China is a repressive authoritarian regime with a terrible human rights, he says. So again, this question of human rights is highlighted. And just a final one as well, Francois, an article in The Guardian, which actually kind of explains why the situation is as it is in the moment. They don't understand Hong Kong. And it goes back to a lot of the policies that have been a little bit at odds between mainland China and Hong Kong since the British territory or former British territory went back to China. And it goes a little bit in depth as to how this crisis has actually come to be.
Simon Harding, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.